So I want to start with Leviticus, which is the most obvious and the most condemning reference to homosexuality in the Old Testament. Leviticus 18:22 says, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman; it is an abomination." And Leviticus 20:13 says, "If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination; they shall be put to death; their blood is upon them." Which seems pretty straightforward and pretty clearly condemning against being homosexual. And just by the way, for the record, I use the Revised Standard Version, so that's where the wording of all my quotes is going to come from. Um, and so, I read those verses when I was young, and I thought, okay, well, that's it. Not allowed to be gay. But the problem with those passages is that they're Old Testament law, and if you think about it, that raises a lot of questions because, for example, in the very next chapter of Leviticus, there are laws against people who are blind, lame, hunchback, or dwarf, amongst others, for making offerings to the Lord, because it would profane his holy sanctuaries. That's in that's chapter 21, verses 18 through 23. Chapter 19 has laws against marring the edges of your beard. That's verse 27. Or, wearing clothes made of two types of material. That's verse 19:19. Flip the pages. Leviticus 11:7 is the law against eating pork. Chapter 12 has commandments to make lots of animal sacrifices. Chapter 20 has a command that adulterers should be stoned to death. And there are statements in chapter 15 that anyone who touches a menstruating woman is unclean and needs to bathe. And we ignore all those rules by the dozen, including lots of others from Leviticus. Those of us who know those verses are there at all because we know that they don't apply to us. Partly that's instinctual, but we've also got a lot of evidence from the Bible that those rules don't apply anymore. So the book of Romans tells us very clearly that we are, and I quote, "discharged from the law, dead to that which held us captive, so that we are not under the old written code, but under a new life of the Spirit." It's Romans 7:6. Galatians 3:13 says, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us." Ephesians 2:15 tells us that Christ abolished the law, abolished in his flesh the law of commandments and ordinances. And Romans 10:4 says that for Christ is the end of the law, that everyone who has faith may be justified. Righteousness through faith is a basic core tenet of Christianity, and it's written into Romans 3:22, Philippians 3:9, Galatians 2:16, and elsewhere. Our righteousness has nothing to do with the old laws anymore. Now, does that mean we scrap the law? You know, and I know, actually, of course not. No, we don't. Jesus says in Matthew 5 that, "Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come to not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all has been accomplished. Whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven." And even though it's not clear that even though it is clear that we're justified by faith, Romans 3:31 says, "Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law." So it's a bit of a confusing combination. It's a very confusing combination to work through at first. The upshot seems to be that the law doesn't apply to us at all, but we still have to obey every letter of it. What makes it more confusing is that as you read through the New Testament, there are clearly a lot of laws that get set aside. Jesus makes others seem more strict than they already were, and a lot of Old Testament laws just aren't mentioned at all, one way or the other. So what do? Well, if you read the New Testament, the really obvious trend is that ritual laws and laws about cleanliness get set aside as completely irrelevant. Laws about sacrifices aren't set aside, but they're permanently fulfilled through the work of Jesus and his death. And laws about how we treat one another and about loving one another and how we pursue God are repeated and often strengthened. So, for example, of all that, Romans 14:14 says, I know and am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself, but it is unclean for anyone who thinks it's unclean. And even though that we know that, we're not good at trusting in it. When Peter is told to arise, kill, and eat in the book of Acts, he refuses 3 times in a row. But then he gets it, and he realizes that all peoples are clean, and he tells us that God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean. So that's Acts 10, the stories verses 9 through 28. And in case you're worrying that it's only uncleanliness that is abolished, we're told, for example, that neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is of any avail. That's Galatians 5:6. And that the early church leaders lived like Gentiles and not like Jews. That's Galatians 2:14. And we're told for fact that for freedom Christ has set us free. It's Galatians 5:1. So the law in general about cleanliness and ritual and symbolic stuff, it's all gone. What we do have to remember is the law to love God and to love one another, and that's everything. So Jesus was once asked, Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. On these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So that's Matthew 22:36 through 40. So Romans says, Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not kill, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this sentence, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. That's Romans 13. And it's repeated in Galatians, for the whole of the law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's Galatians 5:14. So if we ask ourselves, men having sex with men in the Old Testament, clearly not okay. Does that still matter anymore? Does it break any laws that we still have to care about? No, because we don't have to care about purity and ritual and those kinds of laws anymore. What we do have to care about is whether we're loving one another and whether we're loving God. And do gay couples love each other? I don't speak for all of them. The ones who are doing it right do. So is being gay okay? Then yes. And remember, against love, there is no law. It's Galatians 5:22 through 23. Okay, so that's the story of Leviticus, and those are the first passages that I wanted to talk about. It's sort of the broad sweep of everything, and you could actually leave it at that. I mean, I think that's the crux of what we need to know about the law and being gay. So you could leave it at that. I know that people don't. I didn't. There's a lot more that people talk about, a lot more that I've thought about and worried about, other parts of Genesis, Romans, Corinthians, etc. I'll get those. That's why this is a series of videos. And so, but that's the basis of everything. So, love your God, love your neighbor. Fine. Okay, and for the rest, look at the other videos.